February 26, 1991. 2:14 a.m. local time. A column of Iraqi T-72s sat dug into revetments along the Medina Ridge, engines cold, crews scanning the desert through optical sights designed for daylight. They should have seen the enemy coming. 31 M1A1 Abrams tanks from the U.S. Army's 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment rolled toward them across flat terrain with almost no concealment. In any fair fight, the Iraqis would have spotted headlights, heard engines, caught silhouettes against the horizon. Instead, the first thing most Iraqi crews registered, if they registered anything at all, was their own turret coming apart. The Abrams killed in total darkness the way a man with a rifle kills mice in a barn. The thermal imaging system aboard each tank, the AN/VAS-3, didn't amplify light like old starlight scopes. It read heat. Engine blocks, exhaust vents, human bodies, the residual warmth of a cannon barrel fired 20 minutes ago. The system converted all of it into a green and black image so crisp that American gunners could distinguish a T-72 from a BMP at 3,000 meters. In the middle of the night, in a sandstorm. If this kind of breakdown matters to you, the stuff that decided who lived and who burned, drop a comment with what you want covered next. A like and a subscribe tell the algorithm this channel's worth pushing, and that's what keeps these scripts coming. The Iraqi crews weren't incompetent. The claim gets repeated so often people stop questioning it, but it's wrong. Many of them had 8 years of combat experience from the Iran-Iraq War. They understood armor tactics, knew how to use terrain, maintained decent fire discipline. Their T-72s carried 125mm smoothbore guns capable of punching through most NATO armor at combat ranges. On paper, a dug-in T-72 with a competent crew held every defensive advantage doctrine could offer. The problem had nothing to do with paper. The problem lived in the gap between 1970s Soviet export optics and 1980s American thermal technology. Iraqi gunners used the TPN-149-5, a night sight with an active infrared searchlight. To see in the dark, you had to turn on what amounted to a flashlight, invisible to the naked eye, but broadcasting your position to anyone with passive IR detection, which the Abrams had. So an Iraqi commander faced a choice that wasn't really a choice. Keep the searchlight off and fight blind, or turn it on and announce your exact grid coordinates to a tank that could hit you from 2,500 meters. One American tank commander described the engagement afterward in terms that stuck. We could see everything. They couldn't see us. It wasn't a battle. It was target practice. The after-action reports use more clinical language, but the meaning tracks. The thermal sight didn't just let Americans see farther. It let them see first, shoot first, confirm the kill, and move to the next target before the dead crew's wingman understood contact had been made. Engagement timelines from that night show an average of 6 seconds between target acquisition and round impact at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The M256 120mm gun fired a silver bullet round, depleted uranium M829, that traveled at roughly 1,700 meters per second. At typical engagement distance, the Iraqi crew had maybe 1.5 seconds between the muzzle flash and the penetrator arriving through their hull, assuming they saw the flash at all. Most didn't. The muzzle flash of an Abrams firing at 2,000 meters in a dust-choked desert night lasted a fraction of a second. Invisible, without magnified optics, pointed in exactly the right direction. Iraqi tanks brewed up in sequence, one after another, left to right across the defensive line, and the crews in the middle of that line kept scanning the darkness for an enemy they could not find. Their radios filled with contact reports that contained no useful information. Range unknown, direction unknown, number of enemy unknown. The only confirmed data point came from watching the tank beside you explode. 4,200 tanks, 2,800 armored personnel carriers, 3,100 artillery pieces. That's what Saddam Hussein positioned in and around Kuwait by January 1991, the 4th largest standing army on the planet, dug into prepared defensive positions with 6 months to fortify them. Western intelligence agencies took the numbers seriously. The Pentagon's own pre-war casualty estimates projected between 10,000 and 30,000 American dead in the first 2 weeks of ground combat. Hospitals across Saudi Arabia stockpiled 45,000 body bags. The Defense Intelligence Agency's classified assessment from December 1990 used language that made planners sweat. Iraqi armored forces possess the capacity to absorb significant losses while maintaining coherent defensive operations across multiple axes. Their word, coherent. The assumption ran deep. This army had fought Iran for 8 years across terrain far worse than Kuwait's flat desert. Iraqi Republican Guard divisions had conducted combined arms counterattacks at Fish Lake and the Al-Faw Peninsula that reversed Iranian breakthroughs involving hundreds of thousands of troops. These weren't parade ground soldiers. They had buried their dead, regrouped under fire, and learned to coordinate armor with artillery in real time against a numerically superior enemy. The officers who survived that war carried hard-won knowledge about armored warfare that no amount of simulation could replicate. Baghdad's generals believed, with evidence, that their defensive doctrine worked. Stack T-72s in hull-down positions behind sand berms, pre-register artillery on approach corridors, channel attacking forces into kill zones, and make the Americans pay for every kilometer in blood. The Iran-Iraq War validated this approach repeatedly. Iranian human wave assaults broke against exactly these kinds of prepared positions, sometimes losing 10 men for every Iraqi casualty. So when Saddam promised the mother of all battles, his senior commanders didn't treat it as propaganda. They ran the math. Coalition forces would need a 3-to-1 numerical advantage to breach prepared defenses, standard military doctrine going back to the Second World War. The coalition didn't have 3-to-1 in armor. Iraqi T-72s outnumbered Abrams tanks by roughly 2-to-1. Artillery favored Iraq. Logistics chains favored the defender. The math said coalition forces would break through eventually, but bleed for it. The math forgot to account for darkness. Everything Iraq's generals understood about armored defense assumed roughly symmetrical conditions of visibility. Blind at night, fighting in the same dust, degraded by the same weather. The Iran-Iraq War reinforced this assumption because Iranian tanks carried the same generation of Soviet-derived optics. Night fighting in that conflict meant both sides stumbling around at ranges under 500 meters, often identifying targets by muzzle flash alone. Iraqi defensive planning for Kuwait replicated those assumptions almost exactly. Pre-registered artillery coordinates assumed engagement ranges of 800 to 1,200 meters. Kill zones funneled attackers into corridors where Iraqi gunners expected to acquire targets at 600 meters or less. The entire defensive architecture, the berms, the minefields, the pre-plotted fire missions, the interlocking fields of fire, optimized for a fight that would happen inside 1 kilometer. The Abrams opened fire at 2,500. The TPN-149-5 weighed 43 kilograms and sat bolted to the left side of the T-72 gunner's station like an afterthought, because it largely was. Soviet tank design philosophy from the 1960s through the late 70s treated night fighting as a secondary capability, something you bolted on after the primary daytime fire control system filled every square centimeter of useful space inside the turret. The gunner peered through it with his left eye while keeping his right on the main TPD-249 rangefinder, switching between the two like a man reading a newspaper in a dark restaurant, one eye adjusting, the other losing adaptation. The whole arrangement assumed you'd rather fight during the day. Soviet night fighting doctrine made sense on the plains of Central Europe, where it originated. The concept ran like this. Tank formations advance under darkness using active infrared searchlights mounted on the turret, the Luna system, designated L2G on export models. Each searchlight threw an infrared beam roughly 800 meters into the night, invisible to the naked eye but visible through compatible IR viewers. Friendly vehicles could see each other's beams, maintain formation spacing, and identify enemy vehicles by their heat signatures or, more often, by their own IR illumination bouncing off reflective surfaces. The whole system depended on two assumptions that held true in Central Europe and collapsed completely in the Kuwaiti desert. First, that your enemy used the same generation of infrared technology and therefore operated under the same visibility constraints. Second, that ambient conditions, Moonlight, starlight, atmospheric moisture reflecting city lights along the German frontier would supplement your optics enough to maintain situational awareness between searchlight sweeps. The North German plane offered scattered towns, tree lines, ridge lines that broke up engagement distances into manageable chunks. 800 meters of IR range covered most practical shooting situations in fold-gap terrain. Kuwait offered none of this. Flat, featureless hardpan stretching to the horizon in every direction, no light pollution, dust suspended at head height cutting starlight to almost nothing. The Luna Searchlight's 800-meter beam reached into that darkness and died. Beyond it, pure black. An approaching Abrams at 2,000 meters existed in a zone of total invisibility to Iraqi optics, too far for IR illumination, too dark for the passive starlight channel. The front aspect ran too cool for the primitive thermal clip-ons that a handful of Republican Guard T-72s carried. Those clip-ons, the TPN-149, fielded to select units starting in 1986, represented Moscow's first attempt at passive thermal imaging for armored vehicles. Detection range against a tank-sized target topped out around 1,200 meters under ideal conditions. Ideal conditions meant low humidity, no dust, a target presenting its hot engine deck broadside. The American thermal sights tripled that range while reading targets head-on through suspended particulate that would have blinded any optical system the Soviets exported. The Soviets knew about the gap. Internal assessments from the Kubinka Proving Ground, declassified after 1991, rated the T-72's night fighting capability as adequate against contemporary threats in 1982. By 1987, the same proving ground downgraded the rating to deficient against projected NATO thermal systems. The report recommended accelerating production of the Buran-Catherine thermal sight for the T-80 series. That recommendation arrived too late for the T-80, let alone the downgraded export T-72s sitting in Iraqi revetments. Moscow sold Iraq the tanks without the upgrades it knew those tanks needed. Whether that reflected bureaucratic lag, deliberate export policy, or a calculated decision to keep client states one generation behind, and whether anyone in the chain distinguished between those explanations, the records don't clarify. What mattered at 2 a.m. on the Medina Ridge, Iraqi gunners sat behind optics that required them to broadcast their position to see anything at all, fighting an enemy whose sights worked by reading the heat their own engines produced. The Luna Searchlight, the centerpiece of Soviet night combat doctrine for 25 years, had become a beacon. Every T-72 that switched on its IR illuminator painted a bright white flare on American thermal screens. The Americans didn't even need to identify the vehicle type. Anything glowing that hard in open desert wasn't friendly. 14 years and $1.2 billion. That's what the United States spent developing the Common Module FLIR program between 1972 and 1986. A single-minded investment in the idea that whoever owned the night owned the battlefield. The Soviets spent roughly the same period refining active infrared, a technology the Americans had already abandoned as a dead end by 1969. The divergence started at Texas Instruments' Dallas facility in the late 60s, where a team of physicists figured out how to print mercury-cadmium telluride detector arrays onto substrates small enough to fit inside an armored vehicle's turret. The material, HGCDTE, pronounced Mir-Cad-Tel by the engineers who worked with it, responded to thermal radiation in the 8 to 12 micron wavelength band. That band mattered because it sits in an atmospheric transmission window where infrared energy passes through dust, smoke, light fog, and the fine particulate kicked up by tank treads crossing open desert. Every other detection band degraded under those conditions. The 8 to 12 window cut through them. The AN/VAS-3 thermal sight aboard the M1A1 used a linear array of 180 Hg CDTE detectors cooled to minus 196 degrees Celsius by a Stirling cycle cryogenic cooler the size of a coffee can. The cooler ran constantly, burning through its operational life in roughly 1,500 hours, a maintenance headache that drove tank crews and logisticians equally crazy. It also worked. A sergeant from the 3rd Armored Division described the site's image quality during pre-deployment training at Fort Hood in terms his battalion commander later quoted in an official readiness report, "It's like someone turned the lights on and everyone else is still asleep." The cooling requirement explains something that gets overlooked in most accounts of Desert Storm. American tank crews didn't just flip a switch and start killing. The Stirling cooler needed between 8 and 14 minutes to bring the detector array down to operating temperature. Crews rolling into contact had to plan for that lag, keeping sites powered and cooled during movement, which drained auxiliary power units and complicated fuel consumption across entire battalions. The logistics tale behind the Abrams night fighting capability stretched back through generator fuel, cryogenic cooler spare parts, replacement detector modules that cost $47,000 each, and technicians trained at Fort Huachuca who understood the alignment tolerances of a system that lost 0 on its bore sight if you looked at it wrong. None of this glamorous, all of it essential. The thermal sight that killed T-72s at 2,500 meters only existed because someone at Army Materiel Command fought budget battles for a decade to keep cryogenic cooler procurement funded during the lean Carter-era defense budgets. The detector array scanned the battlefield through a germanium lens that rotated at 60 cycles per second, building a thermal image line by line the way an old television drew its picture. Each frame refreshed fast enough that a gunner tracking a moving target saw smooth, continuous motion rather than stuttering snapshots. The resolution, roughly half a milliradian, meant the system could distinguish a tank turret from a hull at 1,500 meters and detect vehicle-sized thermal signatures beyond 3,500. At those distances, the image softened, lost definition, became a bright blob against cooler terrain. Enough to know something sat out there, not enough to confirm type. Standard procedure called for the tank commander to designate the target through his own independent thermal viewer, the GPSE, mounted on the cupola, before authorizing the gunner to fire. 2 independent thermal confirmations before trigger pull. Even in the chaos of a night engagement, American crews maintained that discipline almost without exception. The fratricide rate during Desert Storm's ground campaign came in at 23% of all coalition combat deaths, ugly and a source of institutional anger afterward. But the thermal identification protocol kept it from climbing higher. The Iraqi side had no equivalent process because they had no equivalent technology. Their target identification procedure at night amounted to visual recognition through IR-illuminated optics at ranges under 800 meters. By the time an Iraqi gunner confirmed a target, the Abrams crew had already fired, watched the round impact on thermal, confirmed the kill, traversed the turret, and begun lacing the next vehicle in line. The fire control computer aboard the Abrams calculated lead, range, crosswind, barrel droop, and ammunition type in under a second. The Iraqi gunner estimated range by eye using stadia lines etched into his optic. One system descended from aerospace engineering and semiconductor physics. The other from a ruler scratched onto glass. The smell hit first, diesel exhaust, and burnt sand, a hot chemical tang that coated the back of every throat in the column. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grunison's 2nd Battalion, 34th Armor, rolled into the Shamal at 0300 hours on February 27th with visibility down to 200 meters through unaided eyes. Wind gusted to 40 knots. Sand scoured paint off turret faces. Through the thermal sights, the desert looked like a neon photograph. Every Iraqi vehicle a white-hot shape stamped against cool gray terrain, sharp-edged and unmistakable at ranges, where the naked eye registered nothing but brown murk. The Iraqi Tawakalna Division had positioned roughly 300 armored vehicles across the approach to Objective Norfolk in a layered defense that, on paper, should have channeled American forces into overlapping fields of fire. The Shamal made it irrelevant. Iraqi gunners couldn't see past the end of their own gun tubes through optical sights choked with driven sand. They buttoned up, sealed hatches, and waited for the storm to break. The storm didn't break. The Americans came through it instead. First contact registered on thermal at 2,200 meters. A line of T-72s dug into shallow revetments, engines idling to maintain battery charge, exhaust plumes blooming like signal flares on the gunner's screen. The lead Abrams fired an M829 silver bullet sabot round that crossed the distance in under 2 seconds. The T-72's turret separated from its hull in a jet of white sparks visible only on thermal. The crew of the next T-72 in line, 40 meters to the east, showed no reaction for 11 seconds. Then their Luna searchlights snapped on, sweeping left and right in frantic arcs, painting the dust with infrared energy that reached maybe 300 meters into the chamal before scattering into nothing. On the American thermals, that searchlight turned the tank into the brightest object on the battlefield. Second round. 14 seconds after the first kill. Captain Joe Gruneisen, Dave's younger brother, commanding a company in the same battalion, pushed his platoons through the breach at a pace that chewed through ammunition faster than anyone had planned for. He would leave the Army in 1994 and spend 20 years as a high school teacher in Texas. The battalion destroyed 29 Iraqi armored vehicles in the first 23 minutes of contact. Sources conflict on total kills for the night. After-action reports credit the battalion with between 41 and 63 destroyed vehicles, depending on whether shared kills with adjacent units get double counted. What doesn't conflict? 0 Abrams lost to enemy fire during the engagement. The Iraqis fired back. Muzzle flashes appeared on thermal screens, followed by tracers arcing wide or falling short, rounds aimed at sound or at the flash of American guns, anything to shoot at. One T-72 crew put 3 rounds downrange in rapid succession, all passing more than 200 meters left of the nearest Abrams. They never corrected. The 4th round never came. The chamal stripped away the one marginal capability Iraqi crews still possessed, degraded short-range visual acquisition through optical sights, and replaced it with total blindness. The thermal sights read heat, not light. Sand particles scattered photons. They didn't scatter thermal radiation in the 8 to 12 micron band. The Americans fought in a different electromagnetic spectrum than the weather affected. 23 minutes. That's how long it took 9 M1A1s of Eagle Troop, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, to destroy an Iraqi brigade of the Tawakalna Division on February 26, 1991. Captain H.R. McMaster, 28 years old, stocky, aggressive in the way that made superior officers either love him or keep him at arm's length, crossed the 68 easting grid line at roughly 4:15 p.m. local time, pushing east into fading daylight and thickening sand. By the time his troop reached the 73 easting, the light had gone gray-brown and ground visibility through periscopes dropped below 1,000 meters. The thermal sights showed everything. McMaster's gunner, Sergeant Craig Koch, identified the first T-72 at 1,400 meters, hull down in a shallow fighting position, turret oriented south, gun tube pointed at nothing relevant. Koch laced it. The fire control computer solved the ballistic equation. McMaster gave the order. The round impacted below the turret ring and the ammunition compartment cooked off in a vertical column of white heat that washed out the thermal image for nearly a full second. The Iraqi crew in the next revetment, 80 meters east, did not traverse their turret. Their engine remained at idle. On Koch's thermal screen, the tank sat motionless and hot against the cooling sand, its crew apparently unaware that the vehicle beside them had just ceased to exist. Koch laced it. 4 seconds between kills. Eagle Troop pushed through the Iraqi position at roughly 15 kilometers per hour. Walking speed for a dismounted infantryman jogging, combat speed for an Abrams rolling through enemy defenses. McMaster's after-action account describes the engagement with a flatness that borders on clinical. Target, fire, hit, traverse, repeat. The rhythm of it mechanical, the geometry unforgiving. Every Iraqi vehicle that appeared on thermal occupied a fixed fighting position, oriented to cover an approach corridor that assumed the enemy would come from the south. McMaster came from the west. The dug-in T-72s couldn't traverse fast enough to track targets moving laterally across their front at ranges where their optics registered nothing. Several Iraqi tanks never moved their turrets at all. The after-action data tells the story in numbers stripped of anything human. Eagle Troop fired 61 main gun rounds during the engagement, 28 T-72s destroyed, 16 BMPs, 39 additional trucks and support vehicles, 0 American vehicles hit by direct fire. The engagement reconstruction, later turned into the Army's first fully digitized battle simulation at the Institute for Defense Analyses, mapped every shot fired by both sides. Iraqi return fire totaled an estimated 12 to 15 main gun rounds, all at ranges under 900 meters. Everyone missed. The closest Iraqi round passed more than 100 meters from its intended target. Several impacted open desert with no American vehicle anywhere near the trajectory. The reconstruction team's assessment used language that reads like an engineering report on a failed product test rather than a battle summary. Iraqi fire control solutions showed no correlation between aim point and target location. So, what killed those crews? Not cowardice. They stayed in their vehicles, loaded rounds, fired. Not incompetence in any meaningful sense. They followed Soviet doctrine precisely, engaging at the ranges their sights could theoretically support, using the systems they'd trained on. The doctrine assumed parity, the gap between what Iraqi tankers expected to see through their optics and what actually existed in the darkness beyond 800 meters. That gap contained 9 Abrams tanks moving at speed, firing every 4 seconds, guided by a technology the Iraqi crews had never trained against and could not detect. The hydraulic fluid smell inside a T-72's turret is sweet and faintly metallic, like old pennies soaked in transmission fluid. Every survivor who gave testimony after the war remembered that smell mixed with propellant gas from their own guns, firing at shapes they hoped were there. McMaster's troop reached the 73 Easting Grid line and halted on orders from regiment at 4:37 p.m., 23 minutes. The burned-out hulks stretched behind Eagle Troop in a ragged line running west, each one marking a crew that followed its training into a fight the training never anticipated. 3 Republican Guard divisions were already moving when the Shamal peaked, the Tawakkalna, the Medina, and the Hammurabi, pushing armored columns west into the storm to execute a massed counterattack against what Baghdad believed was an exposed American flank. Soviet doctrine dictated concentration of force at the decisive point. Mass your armor, overwhelm the breach, drive into the enemy's rear before he consolidates. The Iraqi General Staff had studied this at the Frunze Military Academy, practiced it in exercises modeled on Kursk, briefed it to Saddam in presentations that used phrases like armored fist and shock action without apparent irony. They concentrated roughly 800 tanks and armored vehicles into a frontage of less than 40 kilometers. On thermal imaging, that concentration looked like a buffet line. The Soviet counterattack model assumed 2 things that had been true in 1943 and remained true through every Warsaw Pact exercise until 1989. That both sides operated under roughly equivalent sensor limitations at night, and that massed armor moving at speed generated confusion in the defender's targeting cycle. More targets than the defender could service. Overwhelm his fire control capacity. Accept losses in the first echelon to get the second echelon into knife fighting range where numbers mattered more than technology. The mathematics worked when both sides acquired targets at the same distance. A T-72 charging at 30 kilometers per hour closes 800 meters, the outer edge of its own night detection range, in about 96 seconds. 96 seconds of exposure before it can shoot back. Survivable, if the defender also needs most of that time to identify and engage. The Abrams acquired targets at 2,500 meters. At 30 kilometers per hour, a T-72 needed roughly 204 seconds to cross from first detection to its own firing range. 3 minutes and 24 seconds of driving toward a gun that had already fired its first round before the T-72's driver shifted into third gear. The fire control computer aboard the Abrams could generate a firing solution every 6 seconds. 1 tank, 3 minutes of approach, 30 potential shots. The doctrine that prescribed massing armor for shock effect had created a column of vehicles driving single file into a kill zone that started a full 1.5 kilometers before they could respond. We trained to fight the counterattack, a platoon leader from the 1st Infantry Division's Armor Battalion reported afterward. We expected it to be hard. It wasn't hard, They came straight at us in column, and we killed them in order front to back. The Medina Division's counterattack on February 27th illustrates the geometry at its most merciless. Elements of the division advanced west along the IPSA pipeline road in a formation that stretched roughly 6 kilometers deep. Textbook Soviet march to contact configuration with a reinforced battalion in the lead, main body following at 2-kilometer intervals, reserve trailing. The lead element hit 2nd Brigade, 1st Armored Division at approximately 1 a.m. American thermal sights picked up the approaching column at over 3,000 meters. The lead T-72s drove into overlapping fields of thermal fire from Abrams tanks positioned in hasty battle positions on either side of the road. The first 4 vehicles brewed up in under 20 seconds. The column behind them did not stop. Doctrine said, push through the engagement area, absorb the losses, get close. The 5th, 6th, 7th vehicles drove past the burning hulks of the first 4, and each one appeared on thermal as a crisp, white rectangle moving against the dark road surface at a speed that made lead calculation trivial. The Abrams crews didn't even need to traverse between targets. The Iraqis drove into the same engagement window one after another, each vehicle following the track of the one that had just been destroyed ahead of it. The column lost 18 vehicles in 11 minutes before the surviving crews broke formation and scattered into the desert. Scattering should have improved survivability. Against visual optics, dispersed vehicles in open terrain at night become nearly impossible to track. Against thermal sights, each fleeing tank trailed a hot exhaust signature across cool sand, like a pen drawing a line on blank paper. The crews who abandoned their vehicles and ran on foot survived. The ones who stayed with their tanks and tried to find firing positions died in vehicles that had become nothing more than thermal beacons marking their own positions for gunners sitting 2 kilometers away in perfect comfort, sipping water from canteens, killing by the numbers. Southern Kuwait, 50 kilometers west of the Bergen oil fields. The desert floor cooled at a rate of roughly 4 degrees Celsius per hour after sunset, sand radiating stored heat into clear winter sky until the ground temperature dropped below 15 degrees by midnight. A T-72's V-46 engine block, idling, held steady at around 90 degrees Celsius. The contrast ratio on an American thermal sight at that point exceeded 5-to-1. The tanks didn't just appear on the screen, they burned on it. Iraq chose this terrain. Flat, open, minimal vegetation, excellent fields of fire for defenders in prepared positions. Every advantage the Iraqi General Staff wanted for a conventional armor battle. They picked the one environment on Earth where thermal imaging performed at its absolute peak. Cool, dry air with minimal humidity meant almost zero atmospheric absorption of long-wave infrared radiation. The landscape offered nothing, no trees, no buildings, to create thermal clutter or confuse the picture. Every man-made object sat against a background so thermally uniform it might as well have been a shooting range target holder. The American gunners described it in terms that sounded almost bored. Like an arcade game, one sergeant from 3rd Armored Division told debriefers, they just sat there glowing. The smell of cordite built up inside the Abrams turrets over hours of sustained fire. Not the sharp crack of a single shot, but a slow accumulation, acrid and warm, layering into the recycled air until loader and gunner stopped noticing it somewhere around the 15th round. The ventilation fans pulled propellant gas out of the breech but couldn't keep up with the rate of fire. Brass casings piled in the hull basket. The loader's hands cramped from muscling 40-pound sabot rounds into the breech every 6 seconds. Forearms slick with sweat despite the February cold outside the hull. The Iraqi crews who survived described something different. Silence first. Then a vehicle nearby would detonate without warning. Nothing visible, no muzzle flash or tracer, no sound of an incoming round distinguishable from the wind. Just a concussion wave and a wall of heat. Crews reported believing they'd hit mines or assumed artillery. The idea that a tank could kill from beyond 2 kilometers in total darkness without any visible signature didn't match anything in their training or experience. Several prisoners told interrogators they never believed tanks had fired on them at all until they saw the entry holes in destroyed vehicles the next morning. neat, circular punctures smaller than a man's fist, the depleted uranium penetrator having passed clean through both sides of the turret. The exit wounds in the armor told the story their eyes couldn't. The ceasefire took effect at 8 a.m. local time on February 28, 1991. By then, the thermal sights had logged roughly 60 hours of continuous combat operation across 7 divisions. The official tally reached somewhere around 3,600 Iraqi armored vehicles destroyed. Sources conflict on the exact number. The Army's own figures shifted 3 times between 1991 and 93, as battlefield surveys revised earlier estimates downward, then back up. The confirmed count of Abrams tanks lost to enemy fire held steady at 0. That number irritated people. Not the Iraqis, the defense analysts. A kill ratio that approaches infinity breaks every combat model built since Lanchester published his differential equations in 1916. The models assume attrition, exchange rates, some baseline where both sides participate in the same fight. The thermal gap meant one side fought a battle while the other experienced something closer to a natural disaster. Violent, unpredictable, invisible, and completely beyond their capacity to influence. The Soviets noticed. Within 18 months of the ceasefire, Moscow's Armor Directorate had canceled 2 T-72 upgrade programs and redirected funding toward the Burin-Catherine thermal site, a French-Russian joint venture that wouldn't produce a